Welcome, everybody. I'm Dan Mortensen, the current chair of the Pacific Northwest section, and we're here at Resonant Mastering, which is an awesome place that you're going to see in a little while here. But first, I want to remind you that we'll want to see your real name so we know who we're talking with. As Jess was pointing out, you can rename yourself now. When I stop, if you can't figure it out, PM Jess or I, and we'll fix that. And as soon as I shut up here, you'll not be able to do renaming, so please do it then. So our meeting next month will be in the last few days of January, and will be a hybrid in-person and Zoom meeting. Our committee member and audio visionary, James D. J.J. Johnston, will answer the question, what does the word accurate even mean? So think about that for a minute. He gets in a lot of arguments with people on online forums and likes to do these meetings for us to settle a question once and for all so that he can say, look at the damn video. I'm not going to explain it to you again. So he always does really great meetings and is a really smart guy who's fun to talk to and listen to. So again, that's the end of January. The webpage and the Eventbrite to get the tickets should go live with details in a few days from now. For this meeting today, we're going to try something new because there's so many of you. Rather than getting to know you by doing our self-introductions before the presentation, we'd like you to take a second and type in the chat where you are now. And I don't mean in a coffee shop. I mean city, state, country, that kind of thing, because we get people from literally all over the world, and it's really fun to look and see who comes to be in our group with us at the same moment, no matter where we are in the world. So tell us that, and maybe a sentence about your connection to audio, or specifically about mastering or recording. And you might also consider telling us, are you in the recording business? Change page. Uh-oh. Practice this. Are you recording your own material for your own enjoyment? Are you doing mastering? Do you already know what mastering is? Did you come here with questions? So if you want to take a second and do that, I'll be talking for a minute here. We'll look over your responses when I'm done jabbering on about important things. So the question and answer policy tonight will be announced by meeting producer Matthew Sutton when he introduces our presenters. And he'll also tell you when you'll be able to ask questions. We otherwise will want your video cameras and your microphones to remain off throughout the presentation. If your camera is on now, please turn it off. And your microphone should always be off, except when you are speaking to the group. If either of those don't happen, we'll shut them off for you. And when we do it, it's harder for you to turn it on. So please don't do that. Please turn your stuff off now. After the last part of the meeting, we hope you'll stick around so we can meet you and hear more about what you do in audio. We'd like to have these be a conversation as much as possible. We make a point of hearing from everyone, since one of the beauties of this Zoom thing is that we can go on for a while, although we do need to pack up a pile of stuff here in the room at some point, and will, but we can go for a while. I want to do an AES blurb here. We operate as a component of the International Audio Engineering Society, and that gives us the gravitas to be able to invite presenters like you'll meet tonight to our meetings to talk to us. The AES depends on funding from member dues for its existence, and if you're so inclined, we encourage you to do so by going to the Audio Engineering Society webpage and signing up there. They ask for a couple of references, and if you want, you can use us for that, use our names for that. We're proud to be associated with you. We also want to thank those who donate directly to our section by getting the $5 or $10 tickets when registering at Eventbrite. We use that money to pay both for the Zoom subscription and its extra capacity costs for meetings like tonight, as well as for the new Eventbrite fees that make it so we need to have 2 ticketing events for every meeting. Regardless of those and other money needs, it's real important to us that our meetings stay free and open to all people, and we welcome everyone and are grateful for your support, whether it's by your presence or monetarily or both. And I'll say that people who are here or wanted to be here donated over $100 to us this time, which is going to help pay for all this stuff. So thank you very much. And before we go here, I saw that Gary Gottlieb is here. Gary, do you want to unmute yourself? Gary just got elected to be president of the AES and is the president-elect. And if you want to say hi, please do.
Hi. Thank you, Dan. I don't want to take any time out of the meeting because you've obviously got a lot to cover here, but thank you very much for the acknowledgement. I appreciate it. And just to everyone, in case you don't know already, the Pacific Northwest has the absolute best meetings. I go to a lot of meetings from sections all over the world, and I can guarantee you that I always have the most fun at these. And I can't wait for next month, because as I put in the chat, JJ is one of my favorite people. He's awesome. I love the JJ show, and I'm looking forward to it next month, but I'm also looking forward to this one. So back to your regularly scheduled program.
Great, thank you. Those are all great things. Thanks. I think that's where we're going to go from here. So Matthew now is going to tell us what's happening tonight.
Thanks, Dan. So, oh, I am in the right spot. Good, thank you. So I'm Matthew Sutton. I've been in and around studios in the Seattle area since about 1975. And from 75 to about 90, I was an independent tech working in studios around the city, including Ed, actually worked with me for many years. When I started in the business, if you wanted to master a record, you had to find a mastering engineer. And that mastering engineer had to have a lathe, which is a big complex piece of gear that put all those grooves in the record. And without that machine, you didn't have a record. But ideally, you found a mastering engineer who had something more than just a lathe. A friend of mine said years ago that the sign of a good mastering engineer is that they take a tape and they make it into a record. And most of the mastering engineers who were working back in the 70s and 80s with discs and many of them worked until very recently. Some of them are retiring, but they had that special something that takes a tape, or now a file, and makes it into a record. The music pops out of the grooves. The needle doesn't pop out of the groove. The music pops out of the grooves. And they bring to bear a combination of engineering skills, of consistency of approach, making a whole out of all the disparate parts that come in to become that record. And I'm delighted to be here with my friends Rachel Field and Ed Brooks and Annie Larkin, all of whom I've known pretty much their entire professional life here in Seattle. And Ed and Rachel are those master engineers that bring that special sauce that make a record out of your files. And they understand the intricacies of their computer equipment rather than a lathe, but also all the different subtleties that go into the different release media. I mean, a CD is one thing, and Spotify is another, and iTunes is another. And so I'm just delighted that they agreed to join us for this meeting to talk about how they approach mastering and what they do that makes a little bit of their secret sauce. And I want to make sure that you understand that this is not a symposium on mastering. We're not going to sit and talk about the finer points of this or that or the other. It's really intended to provide some good information for everybody on the call, on the meeting, of how you all can make your mixes best prepared for the mastering process. And so at the end of this, I hope that what you come away with is that you learn a few things to help you do your job better, to streamline the process of mastering your release. I'm also delighted that my friends Tom Hall, Chris Rahm, and Trevor Spencer have joined us, because when we're talking about how you can optimize your mix for mastering, they'll be part of that group discussion. So the format of the meeting is we'll spend about 15, 20 some odd minutes with Rachel and Ed and Annie talking about mastering, talking a little bit about their studio and their gear. And then we'll just move into a conversation where we'll talk about what are some of the interesting things that come in on files sometimes that make it harder for the mastering process to occur. And we'll talk with the mixing engineers here about how they work to not have that kind of problem. So overall, I hope that you all come away with something that's really valuable from this, and I want to thank you all for joining. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to you all.
Tonight, I think it was mentioned there might be a really wide sort of spread of experience and skill level with everybody who has joined the meeting. So we thought we'd start with a sort of brief overview of what mastering is at the very basic level and what a project with Resonant Mastering kind of looks like from start to finish. So like one of the sort of more really simple and commonly accepted definitions of mastering, if you can do that, is that it is the last stage of music production and the first stage of manufacturing. And so what that really means is that we are the last opportunity to make any changes or corrections if needed before it goes out to the manufacturer. And we also prepare the final formats that go out to manufacturing and distribution. We start with, usually what comes in is files, stereo mixed files. Sometimes we'll work off of tape. We'll run through the stereo bus processing, which is that's the meat of the matter. That's the part everybody wants to talk about, is the stereo bus processing. And then once that's finished, we have a review process. Sometimes we make a few adjustments for our clients. And then once we have an approved version, then we go from there. And that's, do you want to add anything to that part?
I will. I mean, I think that the point that you made about us being the last step in the production is really important. And we recognize that we are the connection between the project and the people who are going to listen to it. And so Annie Larkin, who is our production engineer.
My turn.
Your
My turn. So once everything's approved, then everything kind of comes into my court and I get to help shepherd everybody the direction that they need to go. And I'll make the files that you need. If you're going to vinyl, then I'll make your vinyl pre-master to send to your lacquer cutter or whoever's doing your manufacturing and distributing. I make the DDPs, and I get to sit and listen to everyone's projects from start to finish and make sure that there's no weird stuff going on in there. Yeah.
Super important part of the process, like the
Nice.
QC
Yeah.
part. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's another really important factor in sending something to a mastering house.
And she has super ears.
Yeah, for sure. If it's in there, she'll catch it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's keep passing the mic around.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, just as like a quick story today, Rachel and I were sitting having lunch. Annie was QCing a project, and out of the corner of my eye, I could see her going between two different screens, zooming in, zooming out. And finally, I just went, "You're hearing something, right?" She's like, "Yeah." And then eventually she found a little tick or something, but it was in the mix. It had been approved. So we knew that this was going forward, but yeah, great ears.
And so if we are working on a project that's 10 songs, just like Matthew was saying, we'll take those 10 different mixes and turn it into a record. And so what we're looking to do is make it all feel like it's part of the same album or part of the same, on the same canvas or kind of in the same frame. We use specialized tools for mastering, but they're all the same types of processing you'll see in recording and mixing. So compressors, EQs, limiters, gain, and all of our gear is specialized for mastering, and we'll go into that a little bit as well. So we use all of those tools to create continuity across all 10 of those songs, and then we'll put it together and select the spacing and the sequence and all of that, and then assemble it, and then it's a record.
That's what everybody says on the couch. Oh, it's a record.
now. Yeah. Do you want to talk about the gear?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm gonna kind of show you around the studio. I think I'll be okay standing. And as Matthew moves around to show you the console. Okay. Okay, so we're on our console. Our console, as you can see, is different than a traditional mixing console, but then it looks a lot like a modern home production console where you've got just a few pieces of gear to do the work. Our studio is set up as a hybrid digital and analog studio, and we do quite a bit of analog processing. Not every project goes analog, some stay digital. And that just kind of happens for we just decide basically on what we're hearing, where we're going with that. So to kind of talk about our gear, first piece is our Maselec MTC1 transfer console. And this is basically classic mastering console. It's set up, this size has front end gain. These pieces here switch various pieces of analog processing in and out of the circuit path. We have output gain. It also is where we control our monitors. And when we first got it, when we just like ran signal through it, things sounded better. I mean, it was just like, oh my God, this thing just sounds amazing. Above that is a Maselec MEA2. And this is 25-year-old EQ that still gets used probably every day. If you're going analog, this is going to get touched. In the center bay, the last thing is this Manley Verymu, and this may look familiar to a lot of engineers, but this is a mastering only version, and it's different. You can hear that it's all switches. There's no pots, and the release times are basically double the release times on the regular studio unit. So this will go out to like 8 seconds as its slowest release. We move over onto this side, this part of the console. These two pieces of gear are kind of two of our newest acquisitions, and they are the Lavry Quintessence D to A and the Lavry Ceviche A to D. And these are the heart of our analog setup, basically, because everything we're playing back out of ProTools goes through the D to A, routes through whatever analog processing we want to do, and then back through the Ceviche. And again, we had this box before, which is a Lavry Gold AD122 96 MX, and we used this forever and loved it. We got these two pieces and it was like, wow, a whole new, like, curtains were drawn. So honestly, these are my two favorite pieces of gear in the whole place. These.
Can you talk about how accurate they are channel to channel? I know we tested that at one point.
Oh, it was like, was it hundreds of, yeah, it was like hundreds of a dB. Yeah.
So they track on stereo very, very tightly.
Yeah. And they were, yeah. And it was just flat, and yeah, it's frightening.
Can you repeat the comment? Because when it's off mic, nobody can hear it.
I was just pointing out that the tracking left to right is critical in this mastering. And so these are within almost 1/100th of a dB accurate to left and right channels.
And so then the last bay is kind of a mixed bag. There's another very old box. This is a YCQ1. This is actually a piece of digital hardware, which is kind of becoming a rarer and rarer thing. We've had this for 25 years. And again, it's an amazing piece of gear. It sounds fantastic. It's like, gets touched every day. And yeah, I just absolutely love it. And Rachel does too, I know. We have a Buzz Audio DBC M. So it's a mastering compressor, Buzz Audio. It's our only solid state compressor. And it's got a really great tone. It's different sounding than the Manley. It's different sounding than our UnFairchild. And some records want it, some records don't. And every day we'll hit the switch and go, oh, that's great. Or, no. Above that is Dangerous Audio Vax EQ. Another fantastic EQ, really unique, and really musical sounding. And lastly, well, not quite lastly, we have a Waves BCL Max BCL. This is an old Waves limiter that I actually don't know when these were made. I think probably late 2000s. And again, we love the sound of it. And in certain ranges, it works fantastic. So some records go through it, some records don't. But again, it's like such a unique sound. Last piece is this Weiss DAC, which is what controls the source to our monitors. And it's another really important piece of gear because every time it breaks, we have to use a different DAC. And it's like the room sounds completely different. And you just go, oh, right. It's attached to probably the last piece to show you. Is it like easy to get to a speaker? So PMC IB1s, they've been here for 20 some years. We love them. They're our ears. And then there's one last little big piece. Yeah, this one had to have its own rack. So it's the UTA UnFairchild. This is also a fairly new piece of gear for us. And it's beautiful sounding, very flexible. And some records it's amazing for, some records it's not, but it's here if it fits it. Oh yeah. Hiding over there is our Ampex ATR102. And that was refurbished by Mike Spitz, I think, in the late 90s. And it's a great sounding machine. We actually have it modded, so it has two different repro heads on it. So we have the stock repro head, and then we also have, no, I can't remember what they called it, but it was like, it was designed in the 90s to be a much flatter responding head. And so it was supposed to be more accurate, but it doesn't sound quite as fun. And so it gets used more often now as a piece of processing gear where we'll actually send signal to it, record, and then be rolling tape and then pick up the signal off the repro head and just put it into our path, just like any other compressor or equalizer. Once in a while we get tape, but it's getting rarer and rarer. And I think that's pretty much a good look at all the gear, and all your gear heads can kind of tweak. Thank you.
Thanks. So I forgot to say, if you have questions, put them in the chat, and then we'll ask you to unmute yourself and turn on your camera. So at this point, from what you've seen so far, any questions?
Apparently not.
Dan, Gary, anything on chat?
What is your Pro Tools rig?
Yeah, we just run a really basic version of Pro Tools on a Mac Mini. It's not a big workhorse in this room. It's strictly for playback. So it's just playing back stereo typically at any given time. And we come out of that digitally and go into the Lavry converters.
Another question was, can you talk about the room? And I assume the walls and treatment or
Yeah.
maybe furniture or something.
Yeah. So if you can kind of look around a little bit, you can see, well, yeah, we're going to pan around a little bit for you. The room is a room within a room, including the floors. There are no parallel surfaces in here and some absorption in sections in the walls. It's pretty acoustically accurate, but more importantly, we're very used to it in here. So that in conjunction with our monitoring system helps us understand exactly what we're hearing.
Got a number of questions now. Is your input power to the equipment racks specifically treated in any way, like UPS or balanced power or whatever?
We do not have balance power. We do have UPSs on all of our computer and server racks. And then we just have kind of a standard, I think, Furman power conditioner on our main rack.
All right. Is there a standard signal chain, I assume, that you use to start with?
No.
I can
Okay.
expand on that. I mean, there are tools that we know to go to in certain situations, but it's all, the thing about mastering is that it's 100% reactive. So almost every question you ask about mastering, the answer is it depends. So it just depends on what we're hearing. If it goes to analog, it goes through the analog gear. Not everything goes out to analog. Most of it does. But you know, it just typically when I'm working and I am going out to analog, it's just a matter of putting something in the chain and seeing if it responds well or not. It's a lot of A/B, listen, respond, and react and make choices. It's just, there's no template.
Okay. Somebody saw that there was an Apollo at the top of the middle rack. Do you use UAD in your mastering chain sometimes?
At this point, very, very rarely. The UAD was originally our interface for Pro Tools. That was the main reason that we got it. We now use Dante Virtual Sound Card on the Mac Mini as our basic digital out of Pro Tools, and the system works really great. So there was a plugin on the UAD, the Shadow Hills compressor, that I used to use now and then, but now that we have the DBC, you can kind of do the DBC into the Manly and do that same sort of thing that a Shadow Hills would do.
All right, there was a couple of questions that might be part of your presentation, but I'll put them out, and if you want to answer them now, you can, or answer them later. One is, how did you learn your craft, and how do you protect your ears day to day? And another is, do you use reference tracks to calibrate your ears over time and depending on genre?
Do we want to go?
Address those now or later?
Okay, I mean, I learned by let's see. I started working here when this was RFI mastering in 2011. And once I got into that door, I was working in kind of an administrative position. And just sort of tried to be in this room as much as possible, sitting with Ed and with Rick as much as possible, asking questions and listening to them talk about their experiences mastering records and their techniques and approaches. And then coming in here on my off hours and bringing in other material and working on it myself, and making lots of mistakes, making lots of things sound really bad before I figured out how to make things sound really good. And just spending a lot of time listening in this room, listening to these speakers, listening to music I was already familiar with in this room to understand what I was hearing, and kind of also to understand what the goal of the final record should sound like in this room on these speakers. And then after that, it's just been a constant honing at every opportunity, trying new things, and trying really hard and caring a lot. So, yeah.
So I'm going to answer the other half of that question. And some of the mix engineers that are sitting here have sat in this room with me, and I monitor really quiet. I monitor really quiet. I don't even know what it would be on a SPL meter. And that goes back to when I first started, Rick Fisher said to me, most mastering engineers work at 85 dB SPL, and that way they can, keep their ears together all day. And I had been a recording engineer for 15 years, and when you're a recording engineer and the band walks into the control room, you reach for the volume knob and you yard it up because, that's going to make them happy. So I set up the sound pressure meter, set it to 85, started working, and I was just like, oh man, I can't hear that. And it took me probably 3 years to work down to 85. And then another year, I think I worked down to about 82, and I probably work around 80 now. Quieter. I can still hear, so I'm, just taking care of them. Yeah.
I'm probably under 80 and you're quieter than me.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay.
And the other part of that question about reference tracks, do you return to the same reference tracks over time so that you have the same thing that you listen to, or for reference, or are you listening to different things all the time?
Always listening to different things, because that's a way to stay current, in touch, and hear new stuff. And honestly, know the speakers so well that reference tracks really just tells me things about styles or levels that other people are doing.
How critical is our environmentals, temperature, humidity, et cetera, particularly for consistency during a session?
Our room is a pretty consistent temperature, and that's probably kind of all the thought I've ever really given it. So I don't think it impacts us at all.
Yeah. Other than just wanting to be comfortable personally, I don't really think about it either.
Okay. What DAW do you record to? Do you ever use elevated sample rates, especially if the original session comes in at 96K or 192K, et cetera? Do you work at 24 or 32-bit prior to final parts at 16-bit?
Okay. And then maybe after this one, we should get into our discussion. I don't know how we are on time.
Sounds good. We got time as far as we're concerned. It's up to you. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So we have a what is referred to as a pitch and catch system. So we've already talked about our Pro Tools rig a little bit as our playback rig. And then the catch part of it, or the record part of it, is Pyramix. I don't know if you want to maybe get a camera shot of it, but what is the reason we use Pyramix for mastering is because it has really great tools for sequencing and album publishing. I don't know if you can see on the screen, but you can see these little bubbles up here are CD markers. So we can just lay the audio out here on the timeline, set the spacing by feel, and then assign track markers to everything. So that will go through album publishing, create a CD image. And then we can also encode CD text and output a lot of different formats at one time. So that's why we use Pyramix. Pyramix is a full DAW. It can be, you can use it for multi-tracking and mixing. But we use it in this kind of limited way, honestly, as far as what it's capable of, but because it will do all of this encoding and different file format output for us. And regarding sample rate, we operate at 96K. We record everything back in at 96K, regardless of what it comes in at.
All right, we'll hold the other questions till the end or later, so you can do your presentation.
So at this point, I'd like to throw it open to the whole crowd now and talk a little bit about mixing techniques that can optimize for mastering.
Yeah, so Ed and Annie and I got together and had made a short list of things we commonly see that I think if people knew that they made things kind of challenging during mastering, that might help the process a little bit. So we're going to kind of talk about some of those things and then ask these all excellent mixing professionals how they go about whatever the issue is and fixing it or avoiding it to begin with and that kind of thing. So you want to start?
Sure. I'm going to start, and a few of the things I'm going to just say in the beginning are going to be kind of boring, and then we'll move on to the juicier stuff, okay? So a really important thing for us is just prepping your files. And that's like simple things. Clean up any noises that you don't want on the record, because we can never tell. And sometimes like I've cut stuff off going, they probably don't want that. And then it's all great, except there was like that one little noise of like a pin dropping on the floor and I can't hear it anymore. So just send stuff exactly how you want it to set up.
I'll just add examples of that are like if you have stick count-ins at the top of your songs and you want them on there, leave them on there. If you do not want them on there, go ahead and trim those off before sending them to us, or at least communicate the preference to us. And then the same goes for any like extraneous noises in fade outs and that kind of thing. Just go ahead and clean those out if you don't want them in there.
Yep. Next one is listen to the rendered mix file, please. Just because every once in a while we'll get something and wow, that song cuts off kind of weird. And it's like, oh, no, oh, whoa, I didn't get the whole song in there, and just stuff like that. And then it's time consuming, but we used to do it all the time when we recorded to tape. You play the tape back, make sure that you got it. Okay, I think that's kind of that for that part of it. You want to do the communication side of this?
Sure. I guess kind of along similar lines, just try to have really open communication with whoever you are sending your mixes to for mastering. Not what we're showing you here is specific to how we operate. Not every mastering engineer and studio wants things the same way that we do or works the same way that we do. So it's important to communicate if possible and get get the mastering engineer's preferences for how you prep the files. And then if you are a mix engineer who is maybe newer or less experienced or somehow unsure of your mixes, or let's say you just changed mix rooms and you're not really confident of maybe the low end that you're hearing in your new mix room, let us know that, because that will help us understand how much liberty we can or should take, or if you want feedback from us or not. We don't always know. Because, and I think I can speak for both of us to at least some degree, what we aim to do is honor the mix that was given to us. And so if you have a mix that has a ton of low end, we might presume you want that in there because it's in there, but maybe you are unsure of how much low end should be in there, and it helps us to know that. As an example. Yeah, I think that's that. Just having really good direct communication, I think, is important too. And I know, like, we're not talking about the engineering yet, but this is stuff that's just as important as far as getting something through the mastering process efficiently.
I think I could add one little
Yeah.
tidbit to that. I think about communicating with the mastering engineer quite a bit as things get towards the end, because sometimes as the mixer, you're not actually the person who's handing off the files or the tape to the mastering engineer. It might be the artist or the label who's doing that. And so I try to be very clear from the beginning of the process with the artist and the label that I want to help facilitate the mastering process, include some notes for jumping off, and also be there to provide feedback for the process. Because a lot of times you might get totally skipped over, especially if you're working with a label who has done a lot of records. You might not really get included if, the artist isn't the one who's paying for it or something like that. And sometimes it happens with artists too. I've just sent off a record that I, didn't get my notes in before it got sent. And that was kind of a bummer because there was things that I knew that I wanted to include in there that didn't get included. So I think that's, important to think about when you're doing that sort of work. Yeah.
Can you guys on the couch introduce yourselves too?
Sure.
Please.
Well, since I have the mic, my name is Trevor Spencer, and I am a producer, engineer, mixer, and musician here in Seattle. And I have my own studio called Way Out in Woodinville, Washington, which is east of Seattle, across the lake, the east side of Seattle. And yeah, that's who I am.
Hi, my name is Chris Rahm, and I'm an independent recording engineer, mixer, and producer based out of Seattle here. I have a mix room at home and do a lot of tracking in a bunch of various local studios. Yeah, I'm glad to be here, and thanks to everyone for joining me.
I'm Tom Hall. Been producing, engineering, and mixing in the greater Seattle area and occasionally elsewhere for, well, let's just say more than 30 years and let it go at that. I have a control room built in my house that I use to do what is these days mostly mixing, occasionally the odd overdub. But yeah, mastering I've been doing this for long enough that you couldn't have a released product if it wasn't mastered in the old days. And I can't emphasize what a big difference it can make in your end product, having your record properly mastered.
Thank you, guys. Okay, so here comes our first juicy one. And it just starts with manage levels. And basically we're saying sections are too loud, too quiet. Vocals are turned down when the arrangements get sparse. And so because we are listening for consistency across a record, we run into times where section is really quiet and then it gets really, really loud and it gets really quiet and there's drama to it, but it's kind of actually undoing the drama because the level jumps are so dramatic that you don't really, it doesn't feel natural, like musical. And when the vocal gets quieter and louder and it's not the way it's sung, it's really hard to figure out how to make it feel consistent and present and not something that people need to turn up and down. You got.
Yeah, and when you have mixes that do that from section to section, like one section is really, really quiet and then the next section is super blazing loud. What ends up happening in the mastering process is, in order to get the quiet sections to translate as loud enough for commercial release, the louder sections are going to get slammed through all of our gear and our compression and limiting, or we're going to have to make a bunch of edits. Sometimes it's a combination of the two in order to create some sort of managed end result. So yeah, just too big of a valley between sections is it can be a big problem for us.
Back couch.
So I'm assuming you want to know how we might deal with this. For me personally, I mean, if I'm looking for if the arrangement of the song is such that it needs to have some dynamic drama like that and goes from, a couple of elements in the arrangement to, full on orchestration or whatever, I'm going to look at whatever is the core melodic line in pop music that's going to be a vocal and make the dynamics of that vocal right first, and then wrap everything else around that. And I mean, I've experienced this where you go, it looks right. I mean, it looks like this should be right, but it doesn't play in a way that makes sense. And so, yeah, if you can, I mean, generally speaking, probably you're going to want the vocal to get louder as the tune progresses, as the arrangement builds and blooms. But maybe not just have giant changes in level from, very, very quiet to very loud. And then if you can make all the other elements work around that melodic instrument, whether it's a voice or an instrument, it's usually going to work pretty well. Yeah. And yeah, managing levels.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Tom said about kind of like working off of your core arrangement to kind of carry you through the song that way, I think is really smart. And when Rachel was talking about volume between sections and the kind of drama that you're trying to get between things, sometimes with volume changes, I definitely understand that, from a musician's perspective. you know, especially in like a live music setting, that can be really effective. And it's effective in a recorded scenario too. And a lot of times from a mixing standpoint, you know, we are trying to bring the what was produced, the dynamic of what was produced into a format that makes sense for mixing. But I was thinking about, as Rachel was talking about, you know, maybe a really dramatic song that has, you know, a quiet verse and a loud chorus, about the difference between actual volume and kind of perceived volume, because, you know, you can have something that sounds like it was you know, if something was played harder and louder, it's going to sound louder regardless if it is actually louder. So, you know, whether it's automation or compression that you're using to keep your mix in a fluid, well, not fluid, a semi-restrained dynamic range, so it's not too extreme, you know, in its peaks and valleys, I think is something to consider, you know, when you hear a guitar played really loud, regardless of the actual volume you're hearing it at, the timbre of how it's being played is still going to come across. So my point really here is that you don't necessarily need volume to do that for you. And sometimes that might mean, you know, I use a lot of clip gain these days, instead of, you know, doing automation or making compression do the work for me of leveling things. And clip gain is a function in a lot of DAWs. I use ProTools where you can, you know, take a clip or a group of clips and adjust the volume of something. That's just my way of, you know, adjusting volume quickly. But I might clip something up in a section that is, you know, extremely quiet to get it closer to the loud part. So it doesn't need to all be compressed, because again, the same thing might happen in my mix bus, you know, compression, or my track to track bus compression, that's happening during mastering, where all of a sudden you're getting way too much compression somewhere, where it's, you know, not really necessary.
Well, it can invert the dynamics too. If you start quiet and then get loud, you know, the compressor kicks in when the chorus comes in, and all of a sudden it gets small, and it's usually the opposite of what you want. So
yeah. And I think that's why, you know, I was talking about clip gaining, not to be this clip gaining, like I'm not really writing for clip gain here, but I just think it's like it's a useful tool to help normalize things, because as I said before, you know, there's a difference between perceived volume and the timbre of the volume that's being perceived. So, yeah, anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said, hands down. The one thing that I learned very early on, to kind of expand on something that you were just talking about, is adding energy to something doesn't necessarily mean that you need to crank up the volume. And so you can give, one thing that I've learned, and I still learn every day and figure out new ways to do it, is that I can add energy and take energy away from a song and sort of make a mix feel more alive and add sort of movement to it and motion to it by adjusting the energy in things without necessarily having to reef on volume knobs. And the other thing is, and it was explained to me very early on, and I talked about it a lot with students at various times, and with artists as I'm working with them, and musicians as I'm working with them, is subtle changes in gain can add or subtract and really sort of compound things. You don't have to turn something up 3 dB to get that sort of power and that feeling of excitement out of something, especially if you're dealing with something like a drum kit or where there's multiple components to it. Starting off and sort of playing with gain adjustments and everything on a far more subtle scale, you know, turning up an entire drum kit with maybe 16 channels, half a dB, you have now added a whole bunch of extra energy and volume to your mix, even though logic or the brain goes, oh, you know, I've only gone up half a dB, but you've turned up all of these elements half a dB. And so working and trying to be as subtle as possible and keep that sort of, you know, my peak to RMS ratio, or, you know, I'll let you guys talk more about, I don't know if you guys were going to, but sort of crest factor is something that I hear all the time. And it's that I don't have to make a section ripping loud so that it hits you in the chest the way that I want it to, or the way that I perceive the artist has written this part, you know, the bridge of this song, they're really pouring their heart and soul into it, doesn't mean that it needs to hurt your ears when it comes out of the speakers. And so I always sort of caution myself and try and remember, you know, make very subtle adjustments to start and then go from there to see if I'm getting that feeling and the emotion across without having to do that whole volume knob and crank things from one to the other. Because I always have to remember that there is someone after me that has to work on this stuff and it has to make sense to them. I shouldn't have to write a novel about each song and what I did in this so that Ed and Rachel and Annie or the artist can understand the choices that I made. It should make sense just coming across, and it should sort of fall within some basic guidelines so that you shouldn't have to do anything to it for it to do what the song naturally wants to do anyway.
The question came in, can you give examples of what adds or removes energy in different sections?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times I will sort of rely on automation and panning to sort of disperse energy. You know, if something is double tracked, I will duck down one of the two. I'll duck down the double so that it goes back to a single. Or instead of having things panned hard left and hard right so that you have this wall of stereo information, I may pan one thing, you know, at one of the elements at 7 o'clock and then the other one at 1 o'clock. And then I offset faders so that you get this feeling of these two different elements, but you can still really distinguish between them. And I'll play a lot with keeping things sort of moving back and forth, left and right, and doing some automation to add this sense of, you know, flow or motion to the mix. Because then that way I can I can very subtly sort of turn some things down, and it almost feels like you're on a roller coaster, and it feels like you're starting to slow down a little bit without actually pulling things away.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of what we're talking about in energy stuff too, and the sort of things that you're talking about is also arranging. And, you know, I think that I personally tend to mix about everything that I produce, but I also do a lot of mixing for records that I didn't produce, whether they were actually produced by a group and a producer in a studio or just an artist kind of more on their own. But regardless, there's a lot of arranging that comes into play in mixing. And I think that's another really good, we're talking about conversation with just having open conversation in general. That's a really nice thing to have an open dialogue with your clients about, is arranging, because a lot of times people will overtrack, and quite frequently. And sometimes I might overtrack too. But to me, that is also just, if you do something that's one step beyond what needs to be there, that's also just the thing that needed to happen to get to the end of the road. So there's nothing wrong with tracking too much or trying ideas. As you get more and more experience, you tend to have a intuitive nature about what may or may not work for some things, and how far to go with things. But just to get back into the kind of more technical mixing side, with arranging and mixing, I think it's nice to have an open dialogue with your clients, so that you can ask, are you open to me taking things out during certain sections? Do you want me to play with taking things out during sections? I would say that almost like 75% of the time, people want me to go for it. That if I hear something, to do that, because there's only so much. Well, there's infinite space, and recording is an illusion, as is mixing and the whole thing. And just recorded music is, our own imagination. So anything is possible. But when it comes to arranging things smartly for a mix, it's nice to be able to pull things in or out, and just keep good dialogue with everybody. And I actually have started, this is kind of a slight tangent, but something that I think we can all appreciate with talking to our clients and having a nice open dialogue. I've started to send artists, even ones that for records that I produced, I send artists a sheet that has all of the possible things that I could want to know from them before I start. So all of the questions of, do you want me to tune your vocals? Do you not want me to tune your vocals? Do you want me to play with the arrangement of your song? Please include these specifics if you want certain effects on certain sections and things like this, especially because I think like a lot of us, we do our work largely on our own. So I found that to be a really helpful thing in communicating, to have, I call it my, I think I call it my, I guess, my mix disclaimer and artist to do. The title is always changing, but it sounds like maybe a little unsexy to do something like that, and to be so kind of like have this like document for people. But it really pays dividends. And I think that most people, and this isn't everybody, because I certainly work with some people who are not interested in this sort of pencil pushing. But I think most people appreciate it. So anyways.
Can you answer a couple questions? First, what do you mean by overtracking? And then maybe the other people there can answer a question that came in. Under what circumstances, criteria will you reject a project? And I don't know if that's accepting it or once you got it finished.
Great questions.
Overtracking.
Yeah, overtracking. There's, like I said, recording and, your record is, totally up to your imagination. And theoretically, there's, especially with the technology we've been provided these days, there's no such thing as overtracking. But in our mind's eye of wanting to make something that feels cohesive and good, like, I think you get to overtracking when, gosh, there's so many examples of overtracking, but
Well, what does
uh,
over mean? What tracking
over-
just means making
okay.
separate tracks, right?
Overtracking would be having too many tracks. I guess if you think of like having, if you have a mix that is guitar, bass, drums, and vocals, and that's the core arrangement, and that's kind of the band. And maybe you have a few other little overdubs, which is, you know, pretty common for most records. If you have 4 guitars doing the same thing in one section, I might call that overtracking. Sometimes that is a creative choice to get a specific sound. But I would say once you are, you know, doubling, tripling, quadrupling, whatever is past that, that's probably an indication that things are getting overtracked. When there's too many layers of maybe the same sound doing the same thing. Again, it's kind of a creative choice, but in my experience, the records that have been overtracked problematically are ones where there are too many layers of the same thing, doing the same thing to get a different sound where it would have been more effective to have one sound doing that thing, one drum
Okay,
kit,
thanks.
one guitar, that kind of
Got it. Thank
thing.
you.
Yeah.
So when would you reject a project, Tom?
Well, I typically only agree to do a project if I've heard it first. I mean, if somebody approaches me, if a new client approaches me, I'll ask them to send me, you know, some rough mixes of what they're working on, and I honestly couch it in the terms that I want to make sure it's something that I have something to offer. You know, that sometimes people will send me stuff that is just, I don't understand. And I'll just go, you know, I don't think I'm the right guy for this. Aside from that, I mean, you know, I guess there's a point, well, and this is not a new thing, that no amount of knob twisting and fader pushing is going to make it sound good. I'm going to turn that down. You know, if it's just so broken, so poorly executed, you know, bad writing, bad playing, bad arranging, I'm going to probably say no, just because I can't, it's not going to be good when I'm done with it. And why would people want to pay for that? It doesn't happen very often, but I have turned down projects on occasion.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks. Do you want to give it back to Rachel?
Well,
Or-
okay.
Sorry, Tom. Actually, I'll add to the turning down a project question. I will at this point turn down a project if I feel the client has been rude to me or my team. And and this actually has not happened, but if content comes in and is misogynistic or racist or homophobic, I will send that back. But our clients are pretty awesome, I will say. So these things come up very rarely, if at all. Okay, so let's talk about another thing that creates obstacles in mastering. What? Did that sound ominous? We were joking before the meeting that we were having a mixers versus mastering engineers battle in here. Okay, so something that's that comes up a bit is overdriving the mix bus or having a limiter or a compressor on the mix bus that's getting overdriven, otherwise saturated, overcompressed, or limited. And so the problem that presents us is that Chris mentioned crest factor. So what that does is it reduces the crest factor, sometimes also referred to as dynamic range, but that is the difference between the RMS level and the peak level in your audio. And that is the headroom spec we are probably most interested in as far as your mixes go. And if that is too small, there's not a lot we can do with your audio, except probably turn it down. And the other the other thing that can happen when overdriving a mix bus, even if you have a reasonable crest factor, is things can become oversaturated pretty quickly, and then that can make it difficult to get through our gear cleanly. Do you want to add anything to the problem side? Okay.
I will just a tiny bit.
Okay.
It is the opposite of the last subject, and Tom touched on it when he was talking about compression, and it actually seems to invert the arrangement. So if you're driving your mix bus too hard, then the quiet parts feel too loud, and then we're doing the opposite thing, trying to make the sections that should be loud or rockin' come up. The one other thing I will add, and this happens a lot with saturation, where we'll get a mix and, you know, you look at the waveform and there's no dynamics in it, but you'll get to a loud section and suddenly it gets louder, but it's usually because something is now sort of pushing its way on top of everything else. And it's kind of hard to describe because it's not compression, it's not limiting, it's just like a whole new sort of way that people are trying to color their mixes, but they're driving it so hard that it kind of gives us nowhere to go. So, all right. I have to hear what you guys say.
Yeah, you know, the funny thing is, I totally understand, and I have been very careful with my mixes to try to eliminate those problems. I mean, really, as a mixer, for me, I want to do everything I can to make your job easy, because then you can actually bring more creativity and more inspiration to what we're doing. And a little sidebar to that, I think it's really important, whether you're a home recorded artist or a professional mixer, to develop a relationship with your mastering folks so that they know what you do and what you're going for, and you have a dialogue. And if they hear something, go, I don't think that's what was intended, that they'll pick up the phone and call you. But back to the delivery of the first big chunk of my career, I was trying to get rid of distortion and everything, trying to get things recorded absolutely as cleanly as possible. Now I find myself looking for tools to put distortion back in. But you got to be really careful with that stuff, because it compounds very quickly. And actually, it sort of speaks to what Chris was talking about ways to add excitement. You know, there are a billion different plugins that have a billion different colors of distortion that you can add. On my stereo bus, I actually use some very subtle harmonic distortion that makes it feel more like what I recall in analog consoles. You would never know it was there if I didn't tell you. I also tend to use a little bit of compression, not always, but frequently on the stereo bus, but it's going to be maybe a dB.5 gain reduction max. And again, you shouldn't be able to hear it. You should just hear what it does to the mix to make it work. For my clients, I'm going to send them something that also has been starched up a bit, so that they can hear it competitively against other commercial product. So they won't go, why is mine so quiet? Because it's going to be, you know, 4, 5, 6 dB quieter. So I personally like to use the Waves L2 just to get some level. And when I send the mix off for mastering, it does not have the L2. It just has my bit of stereo bus processing. And most of my stereo bus processing is aimed at replicating my experience of mixing through an analog console. But yeah, talk to your mastering engineer, you know, have a conversation. Make sure that they understand what you're going for and what the aesthetic is, and give them the latitude to build on that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Tom was saying. There's a couple things that I'd like to sort of circle back to in regards to the same topic, which is less is more. You know, be subtle. A big thing that I learned early on, and I work with daily, hourly, you know, on every song, whether I'm recording or mixing, is that I can make space for things without having to turn other things, without having to turn them up. You know, simply by adjusting a pan pot on a guitar, I can make that vocal pop out. And, you know, I can turn the guitar down a little bit. I don't have to keep adding. You know, using subtractive practices to sort of make space for all of the elements in there can be so much easier, because then I have the room on my mix bus to do some creative things. Then if I really want that distortion, I can add it and it's not fighting with other things because everything has a space. And trying things subtly and one element at a time. You know, there's all of these saturation plugins, and I mean, there's probably 1,000 different saturation plugins and tape simulators and blah, blah, blah. I see a lot of newer engineers, you know, kind of just putting that across every track on their mix. I'm like, okay, if you don't know what an ATR sounds like and what that's supposed to be pretending to do in a plugin form to your track, you sure don't need 30 of them. You know, if you want to go with that little sort of tape slapback on a guitar, put it on the guitar. Try it out there and know what it is that you're doing. Loading plugins that are, you know, supposed to mimic the distortion and harmonics of a specific piece of gear. We've all seen stuff on Reddit. We see stuff on all of these blogs, all of the rest of that. Grab something, you know, learn what 4 pieces of gear do and why you grab an API versus a Neve versus a SSL, and play around with what that actually sounds like before you just start stacking these things on individual tracks and your mix bus. If you looked at any of my mix sessions, you know, even mixing in the box, the individual tracks themselves are pretty empty. It looks like an analog console, with the exception of a couple of other things, you know, a couple of random things like de-essers or a different flavor of compression. But the simpler you can keep it, then the easier it is to figure out later on where you went wrong. And I make mistakes all the time, and I kind of paint myself into a corner and go, well, I don't like what this is. Okay, here, let me just get rid of this stuff and kind of work backwards and then start by building things up again. And I mean, you know, Tom kind of nailed it. Like, if I'm overdoing everything and driving things too hard, then the mastering engineers don't have room to do their stuff. If I'm recording something, I want to make sure that whoever is coming after me to mix it, whether it's me or someone else on this couch or someone else in, you know, around the world, has the freedom with what I'm giving them. They've got good ingredients and they can add their flavor to it. They can add their art and sort of bring the best out of the song. And at the end of the day, I have to, you know, I always remind myself that this isn't my art. Like, this isn't my story to tell. I'm helping someone else tell their story. If what I'm doing makes that story less palatable, either to the person next in line working on the production or to the end listener, then I'm not doing the song any service. and I shouldn't be working on it.
Question came in. Have you worked on international foreign material where the instruments are not familiar to you and or the musical styles or preferences? And I guess that relates to, do you have styles that you specialize in and styles that you don't touch, genres? Not sure who that's to.
Yeah, I mean, I have done a couple of one-off projects with some Eastern artists. And I'm trying to remember the name of the duo. It was a percussion and stringed instrument duo from Beijing. And the instruments were beautiful. I'd never sort of dealt with either of these instrument setups before. And I just kind of listened to the two players warming up and decided, okay, something sounds cool where I'm standing here, and I walked around the room. I want to capture this, and just went from there. And I talked with the artist. I picked their brain. Okay, what do you want to hear? How do I best serve what it is that the story that you're trying to tell with your instrument? And then I went from there. As far as styles of music, I work on just about anything as long as I enjoy the story and I enjoyed kind of working with the artist. I do end up typically working more in certain styles and genres versus others, just because a lot of this business is word of mouth. So, you know, the rock record that I did 2 years ago, friends of the people in that band got referrals to me because they liked what I did on that record. So I do their rock record. But I don't turn down anything based on style. I more steer away from things if I don't think that I can do any good. If I can't serve the song, then they need to call someone else, for whatever reason that may be.
Okay, others, as you pass the mic back to Rachel.
I just thought, like, tangentially, something that both Tom and Chris had mentioned about turning people down, I think is probably one of the most brave and smart and kind things you can do for somebody that you feel like you can't do service to. And it's hard because, you know, a lot of times you want work or you want experience. And I think it kind of depends on who you are and what you're interested in, obviously. But I turn quite a bit of people down, honestly, because I feel I'm interested in a lot of music, and it's not that I have so many people knocking at my door or something, but I try, and especially when it comes to production, I try and be specific with that, because, you know, it's just going to be an uphill thing, you know, from recording to mixing to mastering, if I don't understand what's going on and I'm just doing it for the money. I think if you can have I know quite a few people that have a really good kind of like, for lack of a better set of words, like a blue collar kind of mentality about recording. And it's really flattering to have anybody ask you to work on their project. And I try and see things from that angle before I get like too deeply into deciding to reject something. Yeah, I think that's just something that's important to consider for all of those out there that are maybe early on in their journey, because also, you know, like Chris was saying, when you have an artist that you're working with that you like and it's in the right kind of genre and it's in a comfortable place for you, you might end up getting more work in that same zone and through those friends and connections and things. So, yeah,
All right.
I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
right. I hope everyone is taking notes because this is gold that we're all hearing here from these three mix engineers. Let's see. I have another category here that I'm just going to mention. I'm not going to pass it off for conversation because I think we've kind of covered it already. But we're finding folks are pushing their plugins too hard quite a bit lately. And I think like part of this is there are a lot of really great plugins now that we haven't always had, and they're fun and they're cool and they're groovy. And it's really easy to just go a little too far with them. We're seeing this with, I already mentioned saturation plugins. Stereo widening is one that gets, if you use it, less is more, that gets pushed a little too far pretty frequently. So just kind of be aware. I think everyone's kind of talked about less is more and that kind of concept. So that definitely applies to the plugin use. So the next topic here, something that makes it pretty challenging during mastering is having this is kind of hard to describe, but different sections of the frequency spectrum. Like if you were to break up the low end versus the mids versus the highs, it helps us a lot if your low end instruments are mixed properly relative to each other. For example, the bass guitar and the kick drum need to make sense together. If your let's say your kick drum's too quiet and your bass is too loud, something's going to come out suffering in the end big time. If we're trying to manage your bass guitar, your kick drum's going to maybe all but disappear, or other things like that. I guess an example in the higher frequency ranges would be like a ripping loud hi-hat and maybe upper register guitars that are too quiet, or stuff like that. If that's not in balance with each other, that can make our job pretty challenging. So let's hear about that a little bit.
Julie, start. I'm so psyched to talk about this, honestly, because everybody in the chat is just ripping to know how to get their low end right. And yeah, you know, I don't know, it's always hard. There's a few things that play into it. I think to really bring back our conversation to a little bit earlier about listening, and how loud you're listening, where you're listening, whatever, and reference tracks too. I listen to a lot of music in the studio, honestly, almost every day, because honestly, sometimes my perception changes week to week, or depending on what I've been listening to a lot recently. The way that I want to hear low end might change. So I happen to be the kind of person that does have a subwoofer in their studio, just because it's better for the monitors that I have. And I am constantly changing the level of that subwoofer, which may sound pretty wacky to some people, but for me, my perception of what is flat is always changing a little bit. And I think you just got to do what makes sense for you in your room and listening, because regardless of how well your room is set up and how it's tuned, you just need to know what flat is for yourself at the end of the day. And of course, you know, that's a whole psychological conversation to get into, but knowing what flat is to you is important, and listening to music and having an understanding of what, you know, low end sounds like in other music and how loud it is in your room is a really good starting off place. It's definitely the first thing I do when I get into a studio I haven't used before. I want to be listening to music in there for as long as I possibly can before I start recording. And I don't typically mix anywhere else besides my own studio, but I would certainly do the same for mixing. And then just to get into like low end and mixing, you know, low end decisions, I think they obviously start in recording. And I think I'll just start with talking about kick drum and bass guitar, because those are the two main components that many of us are dealing with low end. First of all, I would say giving those two instruments their place and giving them sort of their own place by high passing your tracks and making sure that there's not unnecessary rumble or low end coming off of other tracks that might have low end. To give yourself as much clarity in the low end is an easy place to start. And a lot of times when I'm mixing or recording, really to begin with, kick drums and bass, I'm trying to think about the sort of center frequency, the center low frequency point of those two instruments and how they relate to each other. And that might come down to even the way that something is being played on a bass guitar, where if you have a really low kick drum and that's the sound of the track that you really need, you might need to move that bass guitar up the fretboard a little bit to be able to get that to translate. And that sort of smart production and arranging is really what's going to get you there. Not mixing. There's a lot that can be done in mixing, but when you are producing and arranging a song, making those sort of decisions like, okay, this bass part is really low. We all like that. We're deciding that the bass is going to be the sub-dominant part of this mix. I might switch the kick drum out from a 22-inch to a 20-inch to just bring it up a little bit, just to move the center point of where the low end is sitting up a little bit, or tune the kick drum up. Making those decisions while you're recording is extremely valuable and is going to make things sound clearer and louder really fast. So yeah, those are probably the three main things I think about with low end: high passing tracks, giving your low end instruments space, and making some decisions about in this particular example, which is an example that we are dealing with a lot, the kick drum and bass guitar. Where is the low end for each one of those things? Which one is higher? Which one is lower? That's kind of the most basic way that I think about it. And it can be confusing really, really fast when you have a mix that you didn't produce and those two things are sitting in the same spot. We've all dealt with that. And there's some technology that, you know, we can use to get around that these days. There's a lot of great visualization in EQ plugins. I use the FabFilter Pro Q3 a lot, and has a visualizer where you can overlay the EQ of another track onto it. So I'll put, you know, the kick drum EQ onto the bass EQ, and so I can visualize it as well as hear it. And maybe I'll make a cut in the bass guitar where I want the, yeah, exactly. And that sort of subtraction, usually, as we've talked about, subtraction being our main EQ tool that we're probably all using. I mean, there's definitely addition that happens sometimes, but I would say that most mixing and recording engineers are doing a lot more subtraction for good reason than they are doing boosting. So when we're in a mix and we're having a huge low end fight between the kick drum and the bass drum, again, you know, we might dip a place in the EQ of the bass that we want the kick drum to be focused in a little bit more. And we might have to boost a little place and cut a little place in the kick drum. So we're kind of moving things around to a place that makes more sense. Yeah.
There was a question that came in about low end asking, do you tend to master low end that is not previously side chained? I'm not clear how that relates. But
I'm not sure if I understand the question.
okay. I didn't either. I thought that was because I was not a mastering guy. Can you hand the mic over to Ed, please?
I guess I'm just kind of theoretically thinking that the question is probably where you have the kick drum side chain to the bass, and you have some sort of a, you know, dynamic EQ that's going to actually dip when the kick drum hits.
Yeah, that's like the next level of what I was talking about.
Yeah. And that is something that in mastering, we cannot do because we're working with stereo tracks. I mean, I know Rachel's making the sound next to me like, well, there are ways. Yeah. Yeah. So I want to hand it back over to these guys because like low end is.
What's up, Chris?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we could spend a week probably talking about low end and various ways to sort of tweak it. I think, you know, in general, the best thing that I could say for everyone, kind of whether you're working in $1 million room or you're working in, you know, your guest room / second bedroom / you know, cat room, whatever it is, with a couple of speakers, a pair of headphones, and a laptop. Treat the room as much as you can, get things out of your way as far as your listening path, and then get to know your room and recalibrate your brain to that room. I'm lucky enough that now, because I have a mix room built into my home, like I don't have to worry about people coming in and moving things and, you know, are things set up differently from one day to the next. But I still go in there and I'll put up a mix that I did the day before and I'll start questioning it and going, okay, is that really what you know, and I know my room really well. The big thing is get to know your space. Whatever gear you have, know it. Spend days, weeks, months, years listening to those speakers. And Ed and Rachel talked about these two speakers here being their ears. I mean, they know if either of these speakers has a weird resonance, they know instantly. You know, and along those lines, I have some external monitoring in the form of like an RTA and a scope that I can throw on things, because some days my head's not in the same headspace that it was a couple of days ago. And so I'm not paying the attention to the low end, or I'm perceiving low end differently or whatever. Having that little visual reference, and you saw it kind of as they panned around the room here, you could see that they have a scope. Having something that I can refer to and sort of just check, hey, is this actually what I'm hearing? And looking down and seeing a scope, you know, whether it's a visualizer in an EQ plugin that's on your mix bus or an actual external scope, give yourself whatever tools you possibly can that you can verify and double check and triple check what's actually going on. Because if you're coming down to the cold, it's going to sound different. You just took a shower and your ears are full of water. Things are going to sound different. Jumping from, you know, one song to the next. Yeah, it's going to have the same basic 4 elements, but how they were recorded could be very different. And so you can't assume that what worked yesterday is going to work today. And so whatever you can do, whatever stage of your sort of career you're at, the more extra tools you can give yourself as a backup to be able to sort of double check these things before you move on to the next thing, the better.
So you're talking about using visual tools to help you. A question came in, do you find that mixing with EQ plugins with visualizers leads to a lot of mixing with your eyes instead of your ears? And is that a problem?
I personally don't, but I have the luxury of working with a control surface. So anything that I'm doing in the box, I'm turning a tangible knob. and chances are I might not even be looking at a screen in Pro Tools as I'm doing it. If I'm in a setup similar to this room where the Pro Tools rig or the computer is off to one side, I'll set my control surface between the two speakers directly in front of me, and I will tweak stuff with my head pointed towards the speakers, not pointed towards the screen. The visualizer element of plugins and the scope. The scope and the RTA in my room is off to one side, below a speaker. Just kind of in my peripheral. It's not right in front of my face. I don't want to see it all the time, but I want to know that it's there if I need it. You know, I think of it like a parachute. They're in the plane. I don't need to have it on all the time, but when I need it, I want it to be there.
I just had something kind of quick to add on your thought path there. I mean, low end is probably one of the most challenging perception, psychological war games you play with yourself. I mean, all the way through mastering, you know,
Even after the record's out.
even after the record's out. Yeah, totally. You know, and it's always different for different genres and artists and everything, what you want out of something. So anyways, I wanted to kind of go back to reference tracks again, and listening to other music, especially for the people out there that are maybe just getting started. And I don't know, I guess I feel like anybody who's trying to get better all the time, I think you probably should be trying to get better all the time if you are somebody that wants to succeed and make friends. I like to scare myself, as I call it, by listening to other music while I'm working sometimes. Because it is scary sometimes as you are working on a mix to listen to something else that you know sounds good. And sometimes you got to scare yourself. And as part of that, I also think that just in this sort of mind game that we're all playing, it's helpful to take breaks while you're listening. I've started to try and only work for about 45 minutes at a time and then recover my ears until I'm ready to go back. That's when I'm mixing, not necessarily when I'm tracking. But I also, when I'm recording too, I'm maybe a little bit of a, I don't know if a rare case is the right word, but I set pretty serious boundaries with and let people know that I'm not interested in staying in the studio until 2 a.m, which is another valuable thing to keep your mind in the right place among many other things. In my document that I was talking about beforehand, that's something I'm trying to be pretty clear about, because you can get in a disagreement with somebody pretty quickly if somebody wants to stay for 12 hours and you only want to be there for 8. So that just relates to taking breaks, and because you're going to lose bearing as soon as you start feeling confused about something. Sometimes that means it's time to take a break for a moment. When you start to get like a little bit of a headache and you start to feel a little numb, it's good to take a break and maybe listen to some music in between to scare yourself a little bit. Yeah.
One final thought, perhaps, about the whole low end thing. Listen to your mixes in as many different places as you can. Listen in your car, listen on your phone, listen, through your TV if you can. Listen in as many different places as you can. And if the core values of the mix are hanging together, you're probably pretty close. But I mean, if I didn't have my car to double check the bottom, well, I'd probably be disappointed a lot more than I am. Yeah,
the same car for a while.
Yeah,
too.
well, it's helpful,
I'm-
yes.
I'm pretty scared of losing my car at this point. Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing about that too, is, well, that thought completely escaped. Anyway, yeah, getting the bass right. I mean, I've been doing this a really long time, and most of the time I think I hit it pretty close, but you know, it's challenging. Well, especially if you don't have a superb control room, because if the room and the speakers aren't telling you the truth, it's really hard to get it right. Um, and you can buy the most expensive speakers you can find, and if they don't work with the room, it doesn't matter. It's not going to help you. So yeah, listen in as many places as you can, and it'll make mastering way easier.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for that. I think I can kind of dovetail this other one right onto this conversation here. And just kind of hit it home. If you don't have an accurate space or you're not sure of what you're hearing, get some way to use visual tools like meters, like Chris was talking about, and learn how to read them. So that can be a way to just sort of double check if you're not sure of what you're hearing, and help you out there. And then I think this is our last sort of bugaboo here. Sometimes we do get reference mixes. So by that, what I mean is when the client sends us their project to master along with a couple of examples of stuff that's already commercially released. And that's what we are to refer to while working on their project, because that's what they want it to sound like. And so we run into a few issues with this in the following ways. A lot of times, let's say we're sent 2 or 3 reference mixes. The 2 or 3 reference mixes are sometimes completely different from each other. And so we don't really understand what we're supposed to take from each of those 3 different references and shoot for. And then the other thing that can make the reference track thing more convoluted than helpful is if you listen to that and then you listen to the mixes you're provided and they very clearly were not referring to the same reference track while writing, recording, and mixing, it can't suddenly be turned into something different at the mastering stage. That is something you have to build from the ground up and work towards that intentionally through the whole process. So I guess the question to you 3 is, do you work with reference tracks? I know Trevor's mentioned it a couple times. And when do you bring that in and how do you make use of it?
Yeah, reference tracks actually are, well, I've been using reference tracks of my own, going back to the days when it was a turntable coming into a couple of channels of the console. So yeah, it's helpful, and getting reference tracks from the artist can be helpful. Sometimes it's confusing and it requires a phone call or 7. I always, when I'm mixing, I always ask for a rough mix of the tracks they're sending me. I mean, I'm working currently with a client in Saltillo, Mexico. They speak no English. I speak no Spanish. So it's really, really helpful for me if they send me their rough mix that is the current incarnation that demonstrates their intent. Because they're not sending me an in-progress Pro Tools session. They're sending me, stems. So, I can pull up the tracks. And with a lot of things, the tracks will tell you where it's supposed to go. You go, oh yeah, I hear what this is supposed to be. But sometimes I'll get the rough mix and I'll put it up and I'll go, whoa, I had no idea that that's where we were going. And then they'll have other commercially released product that they go, we want it to sound like this. And you kind of scratch your head and go, well, let's see, we'll see if we can go there. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's just kind of dreaming. But yeah, language is not a great way to communicate about music. It's the only real tool we have. But if people can provide musical examples, it can be helpful, particularly if it remotely relates to what they're giving you. And yeah, anything that I can do to get inside the artist's head is going to be helpful, I think. I don't think I've ever sent you guys any reference tracks of, it's supposed to sound like this. If you can't tell from what I've given you, I need to remix anyway,
That's really interesting about the artists from Mexico. That sounds challenging and very fun at the same time. Yeah, it's awesome. I think before too, when I was talking about reference tracks, I was really talking about just music I thought sounded good. Not necessarily something that an artist has given me. But I do, and just talking about mixing here, I guess I do this for production too, but in my vibe delivery guide that I send to people, part of what I ask for too is reference tracks with notes about how it relates to what we're doing. Because like Tom was saying, sometimes you get one that's really out there, and it might just be because they really like the way that the snare drum sounds, and it's good to know that. And that's useful from production, arranging, recording, mixing, the whole 9 yards. Yeah, I've never sent a reference track with a master before. It sounds pretty sinister to me, but I think maybe like I don't even really know, like maybe for loudness sake it makes sense sometimes, barely. Sorry guys. I'm just being clear, I've never sent Ed, who I work with on the majority of my projects, I've never sent him a reference. But I also think that outside of the kind of like sonic technical things, like, oh, I like the way that the snare drum sounds, I like how upfront the guitars are in this music, I really like this kind of reverb on the vocal. Those things are great to know, like pinpointing from an artist's perspective, because again, like Tom was saying, it's just so nice to get inside somebody's head, especially if you haven't worked with them before, or even if you have worked with them. It's just really nice to know where somebody is at and like the things that they're interested in, so you can help make their dreams come true, because that's what we're trying to do here. The other thing about reference tracks too, I think it's just nice to, again, in getting inside of somebody's head a little bit, just to sometimes I like to ask, outside of technical pointed things, to just get music that people are listening to as a conversation starter for other things, I think is nice. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with all of this. I guess to kind of get back to what I think I heard at the beginning of your question is how to sort of broach that and everything. I would say as often as possible, as early as possible. The sooner you can start talking about, reference tracks or vibe or, dreams, aspirations, inspiration, all of that sort of stuff, the sooner you can get into that, the quicker I can help an artist sort of get their story told in a way that makes sense to them. And in a way that matches sort of their vision. It doesn't do any good to record 15 songs, get all the way through mixing, and then decide, oh yeah, so this heavy rock record was supposed to feel more acoustic. Like that doesn't do anything. Or, you know, a heavily acoustic record, yeah, we were going for some more grit on here. If there's ever a question about anything, I think those lines of communication have to be open. And the easiest way that I personally find to do that is to ask some of those first date questions, as I like to think about them. Like, you know, I have a phone call with people, or I'll meet them for coffee and start talking about the project long before we have studio time booked if I'm recording it, or before we're handing off a hard drive or any of the rest of that. I want to know, you know, hey, how did you come to find me? How did you do the thing? You know, what are you trying to do with that? You know, yeah. And you know, what are you trying to tell with this? Like, where did this come from? Yeah, so I think that's it.
While you're passing that over, there were a couple of questions about stems or comments about stems. Does those have a role in mastering? And if so, how do you create and master with them? Was the question.
We do. I actually, are we kind of getting down on time? Because I've been so knocked out by the information we've gotten from these three mixers that I have a question that I wouldn't have ever conceived of. So the one other thing that we face in here regularly is we'll get 10 songs and 7 of them have a lot of bass. 3 don't have very much. 4 are bright. 3 are dark. And when I was a mixer, I was sitting at a console and the faders were always the same faders. You may change a piece of gear, but you got a lot of consistency through the console. You all mix through Pro Tools. And so I guess what I want to hear is how, and we're going to have to short answers. How do you make your records consistent? How do you pay attention to what you had on the last track and this and balance? Do you change a lot of stuff? Do you stick with the same stuff?
Quickly, what I do as much as possible, if songs have the same elements, I'll do session data import to, you know, to get the same kick drum sound, to get the same bass drum treatment, and use those as starting points for the next tune. You know, so, you know, I finish one, I go, yeah, that sounds great. You know, mix number 2 comes up, and I'll do a session data import so that I can apply those same sounds. Now, one size does not fit all, but it can give you a starting point that really helps with that consistency. And yeah, sometimes even by design, vocal's going to be brighter on one tune than another one. And it's because it's what's right for the song. And that's my short answer.
Totally. I think what's right for the song is a great thing to keep as your North Star. But something that I do to try and keep consistency is I typically will import other songs from the record into the session and be listening to them as I'm mixing. Yeah.
I do both of those things, and as sort of yeah. But the other thing is, as I said before, like my mix sessions, even mixing in the box, are pretty empty. Like I'm not filling 10 plug-in slots. What I put on there, I know what it sounds like. I know what it's supposed to be emulating. And so I've already made a decision when I first started the record, hey, I'm going for this type of vibe. I'm probably going to use these EQs on the drums, and that will continue all the way through. But that's because I'm not trying to sift through 700 EQ plugins. I've got 10 that I focus on, and I know what those do. And so it makes it far easier to sort of narrow the path.
I want to ask you guys a couple questions, honestly. just really, maybe really quick. Two questions that I've been thinking about. One is how often you get mixes that have limiting on them already. And if you like that, don't like that, I can already sort of hear your answer a little bit, but like just what you think about that. And also something that I've been thinking about a lot that I've been wanting to ask Ed about the revision process of mastering. Because as Ed is aware of, I sometimes like to just send a new mix with the bass adjusted rather than having him adjust the bass. Do you like that? Do you not like that? This could be for Rachel too.
Okay. I like the mix adjustment because it's just more concise, and honestly, I can do it faster. And dang, I just forgot your first question. Oh, limiter. The majority of the time, get mixes that don't have a limiter. There was a record I did this year where, it was never worked with a producer before, and I just asked, send me limited mixes so I can hear as a reference what the record was like. And he's like, there are no mixes without a limiter. And I was like, okay. And the mixes sounded great. I treated them differently. I worked completely in the box, and they were great mixes, and I just embraced it. So the majority of the time, don't get limited mixes.
Really quick follow-up question. Do you like to hear the mixer's limited version?
So Trevor just added a follow-up question. Do we like to hear the mixer's limited version? So if the mixer is sending limited versions for reference for approval, yes, that's very helpful to know what the client has been listening to while we're working. That's super helpful. So we do like to get both that and the unlimited mixes to work from. And as far as putting limiting on the mixes, I prefer it not be on there. There have been some cases like Ed was describing where if it's not totally slammed, it still will actually work out okay. It's just kind of that same answer of it depends. But preferably no limiting, preferably no processing on the stereo bus that's strictly for loudness. And then should I go over the stems? Oh,
Yes, please do.
Okay, so we had a question about stems. Dan, could you repeat that question?
Yeah, and another version came in, how to create mastered stems for sync. The earlier question was about creating and mastering stems.
Yeah, so we do work from stems here occasionally. It definitely is a much more involved process. It takes a lot longer on our end, which of course increases the cost. I think that what's really important about mastering from stems is that the stems are prepared correctly, right? So the stems should be a collection of sub mixes that sum together to represent the stereo mix as identically as possible. Meaning if I line them all up and play them all out of my playback rig at the same time, it should sound like your mix. I think that when it gets a little bit dicey is when people aren't preparing the stems properly, and then it becomes a mix job or a file management nightmare. So another thing kind of going around right now is people are referring to their multi-tracks as stems. Those are two totally different things. Multi-tracks are just your 24 recorded instrument tracks. Those are not stems. Stems are typically stereo submixes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Another question came in a couple of times. What is the preferred amount of headroom, RMS, LUFS? Do you would like from client submissions?
Yeah.
RMS, dBFS, or LUFS?
The unit of measure is not as important. Is the question isn't about the unit of measure preference, right?
No, about the amount.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so another sort of way to look at this, I think I mentioned this already, the most important specification we're really interested in is that crest factor. That is the difference between the peak level and the RMS level. As long as you are not clipping anything or peaking at any point in your mix, so that includes your plugins, your sends, your buses, your individual tracks, and your stereo bus. I don't care if your peaks are up close to 0. I can always turn something down if I need to. 1 to 3 dB of peak headroom is nice. What's more important to me is that crest factor, because as I turn things up towards that 0 dB ceiling, that crest factor is going to get reduced. So that's what gets changed most significantly here during mastering, presuming your tracks are getting turned up. So I would say it varies pretty greatly based on genre, but let's say a typical rock record, we would be looking for something like a crest factor of, I don't know, 10 to 12 dB. Yeah, maybe 14, but enough room to be in there making EQ, maybe compression moves before we yard everything up into that 0 dB ceiling is helpful. So I hope that answered the question sufficiently.
Yes.
Okay.
There was another one that came up about how to, I have to go way back, how to balance a dynamic female voice versus rhythm tracks that are taking up the same dynamic range. But I thought maybe she means frequency range, she or he. Did that make any sense?
I think that's for the back couch.
Sounds like you have this one.
Oh, I was just wondering if you could repeat the question, Ascoli.
I don't even know if I have the answer to this.
Yeah.
Like anything else, figure out how to make room for the vocal. The vocal's obviously in most cases, maybe all cases, going to be more important than the guitar. Figure out how to make the guitar work with the vocal. First thing to do would be maybe to manage the dynamics of that vocal first and get it so that it's not crazy wide. And then, it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier about, huge dynamic ranges. Get that guitar to wrap around the vocal, and so that the vocal's front and center, and people can understand the lyrics if they're supposed to be understood. You guys have anything to add to that?
No, I mean,
That's a great way.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions?
Somebody asked about the differences between mastering for LP versus CD or other digital format.
There are, I'm going to kind of keep this brief. There are important things to take into consideration when mastering if we're going to prepare files for vinyl cutting. And every record that we do here, we pay attention to that, even though someone says, oh no, I'm not going to do vinyl, because you never know. A year from now, they could. So there are two very important things to kind of keep in mind when mixing for vinyl. And the first one is you cannot have low frequency information that is out of phase. So stereo choruses, flangers, and most commonly, I think, keyboard patches, like especially like a bass keyboard patch that's in stereo. Keyboard designers, they like modulation. It makes stuff sound wide and cool. And it's a long explanation to explain why technically that will not cut. The thing that we do here is we have an elliptical filter on our console, which allows us to mono frequencies below its crossover. And so if I see something's going to have an issue with vinyl, I will do a separate version of the song where I will mono the low frequencies. The digital version, CD version, can have big, cool, stereo wide stuff. That's great. People liked it. But if we didn't mono it, what would happen at the cutter is they typically will just use an MS EQ and take the sides and just raise the high pass to 160, 180, 200. And so then that instrument, anytime it's modulating outside, gets kind of thin and then it's thicker through the middle. So it doesn't sound quite as cool. The second thing is sibilance and high frequencies. And again, it has to do with the RIAA curve, pre-emphasis curve that goes on when you're cutting vinyl. It amplifies the high end by 20 dB at least. Yeah, so high frequencies are getting pushed through the lathe at an extreme level. And if you have really spiky, uncontrolled high end, that means the cutter is going to have to DS and sometimes cut your stuff quieter to get a good cut. So it's the same thing. And sometimes, especially with, again, I'm going to be on about keyboards. Keyboard patches will have information up at 16K that nobody knows it's there, and so sometimes I will just hit the screen to go, is there anything up there that I should know about? Because I can't hear 16K. So, and then we have a high frequency limiter that sometimes I'll just turn on and turn down and see if it starts freaking out over the hi-hat. So cannot modulate stereo below, I don't know, safely 200, 240, and yeah, really watch your high end.
A couple of people have asked if you ever master using headphones or IEMs or anything like that in your monitors.
I do not. We do own a pair of really nice headphones, and occasionally I will throw them on when I'm editing fade outs and really, really quiet bits like that. All my engineering decisions are made on the speakers, and that is one, because I know them so well. I trust them, as we've talked about. And also there's just the physical element of the audio in the room that impacts some of my decisions that you don't actually get out of headphones.
Okay. We're approaching our witching hour here. Do you want to tie things together for a while before we call it a night?
I don't know. I feel like everyone's been really helpful and thorough, and I appreciate all the knowledge shared here today. And I hope everybody got some good tips and tricks and knowledge out of hanging with us tonight. Did anybody else want to add anything? Okay, here's Ed.
I want to say the same thing. I want to thank you guys. That was great stuff. I learned a ton tonight, and so thanks for being so informative. You get the last word.
I feel like at the end of the day, almost every single one of these points came down to making sure you're communicating every single step of the way. And I think that part was nailed home pretty well. Yeah.
At the end, when people
Yes. That is my whole job. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
When we've been talking about communicating, I keep on going on about this like document that I have of things that I ask people. But I think as for people that are getting into this and are learning, start making a list for yourself of things you want to talk to your artists about as you're going, because the one thing that you forget may come and haunt you later. It will. So, it's okay to have a list and even send the list, make a list that is sendable. Because it's really nice to communicate well. Imperative.
The one thing that I would say about, and to sort of add to that, and I'd like to thank, AES and everyone sitting here on the couch and in the chairs, and this has been great, is don't be afraid to communicate as a mix engineer with your mastering engineer and sort of, hey, I could never quite wrap my head around X in this song. Tell your mastering engineer. Yeah, it might feel embarrassing to talk to your client. Your client's already signed off on something. The artist loves the song. If you still have questions about it, talk to your mastering engineer. Build that relationship with the next person down the line, because you may be stuck in your head and going over and over this little minute decision with a snare drum or a kick drum or whatever. And when it gets to mastering, they're like, oh, no, that sounds great. No, that was fine. Or, yeah, it was a little bit, it got a little sloppy between here and here on the frequency scale. That's what helps us sort of learn and continue to learn going forward. And just remember, you're always going to make mistakes. The only thing that's dumb about sort of pushing yourself is not being willing to admit that you might be pushing yourself and ask the people around you that you're working with, how you can improve. So that was it.
Yeah, just to echo that a little bit, I think to be a little even more specific, like when you're talking to your mastering engineer, to let them know those things that you felt like you weren't able to get perhaps out of your mix that you are hoping to get. Maybe that's some sort of, for me, a lot of times that's like some sort of glaze or sheen that I know that I can't quite achieve, but mastering might be able to achieve. And it might be something that's subtle. It might be also knowing that there is that I want to leave this record dark. So Ed, please leave this record dark. Ed, I want you to saturate this record more. Ed, could you please do a tape layback for this? Or can I hear an option of the tape layback versus a digital version of this? Being specific and kind is quite smart. And you're always on the same team, and if you don't say something to your mastering engineer that you've been thinking about, they're probably just gonna go off of intuition, which if you're working with somebody who's really good, might be great. That's awesome. But make sure to bring those things up that you've been thinking about.
All right. Thank you all. This has been wonderful. And there's been a lot of really good comments in the chat. And I'm going to open up the floor to the people in the online to tell you how wonderful you are. And I told them that we need to be out of here. We need to stop our broadcasting at 10, but they can keep going 10 our time. So let me remove this spotlight. And people, you can turn your cameras and on, cameras on and just only turn your microphone on if you want to speak. And after 10, Janie will be the moderator of it. But anybody have anything they want to say to these folks?
Well, I'm wondering, you were talking about monitors. What are your favorite monitors?
Let's start. Well, maybe we can each say what we use.
All right.
Yeah.
You got to use the mic. Good.
At home, I've got a pair of Dyne Audios and then a pair of NS10s. And when I'm traveling to rooms that I don't know really, really well, I typically bring a set of custom in-ear monitors and a pair of headphones so that I can reference in the room. And I mean, I've spent hundreds of hours with all four of those listening things, so I know exactly what I'm hearing, regardless of where I am with those.
Yeah, I have the same set of NS10s that I've had since I was 18 with, replaced tweeters and whatever, with a Crown DC 300 amp for the nerds out there. My mains are Tannoy ML10s with the Mastering Lab crossover and the Yamaha P2200 Mastering Lab modded amp. And I have a really basic Yamaha HS series sub that I use. And I also recently put a graphic EQ across it to tone quest it a little bit further. And I use some Audio-Technica M50s quite frequently, for better, for worse, because I understand them.
My mains are some custom Tannoy 15s that are the big brothers of the ML10s. I also have a set of those, but those are in my living room.
Nice.
I used to work with the Mastering Lab a lot, so
Awesome.
also have P2200s driving my mains and my Auratones. I've got a set of ancient Papercone, the original Papercone Auratones that if anything ever happens to them, I'll retire because without Auratones, I'm done. But the Tannoys are actually quite wonderful. And I keep some headphones around. I got some Grados, and I actually picked up some of the Steven Slate VSX headphones, which are curious. I'm not sure if they're great, but they're curious. Anyway, that I think that's what we got. Yeah.
Anybody else have other comments for the panel? Come on, tell them how great they are.
Yeah, I'd like to say thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're
very
welcome.
much.
Thank you.
Took the words right out of my mouth. I appreciate it very much.
Very good.
Yeah, it's been great to see Ed. And, I've been
Oh,
knowing
Peter.
a long time. Yeah. I've been knowing you a long time, Mr. Brooks.
Yeah, it's great to see you, Peter. Thanks.
You bet, bud.
Yeah, thanks for doing this, you guys. I came in late. I'm gonna have to watch the replay, but I saw the invite via Ed and Rachel. So no, it was great. Now this is a great time to be able to share all this stuff. It's just amazing time in history. Imagine trying to figure this stuff all out 35 years ago. So no, but thank you all. It's just it's excellent.
Where are you located?
Thanks, Stacy.
Hey, you're welcome. I'm in Nashville.
Yeah, good to see you.
All right. Thanks for joining us.
No, thanks for doing it.
Do we have any international visitors here who'd like to say hello? Unmute yourself if so.
Bebev, he's talking to you.
Hi, Janie.
I saw Stacy appear for a
Hi.
second there. Hi.
Do we have any aspiring mastering engineers in the group?
No.
Always
Interesting.
recruiting,
Peter?
Yeah.
always recruiting.
Are there people who master their own recorded music or want to do that? Rod, I see raise a hand. I'm not sure who else might have raised their hand. Speak up if you do, please.
And I master just for fun. It's good show.
Good. And Richard Cardoza raised his hand. And hi, Steve. How are you? Good to see you.
I'm good. Good to be seen.
He said as he turned his video off.
Yeah.
Yes.
Dan, there's a little chat message from Bebev. Says, I am not on a system with a mic or a webcam, but I enjoyed the talk very much. Bebev is in India, by the way.
Oh, cool, cool.
He enjoyed the talk very much and joined about halfway and says thank you.
Oh, thank you for joining.
Joining our AES
Cool.
Northwest meetings after we started doing this Zoom format, and he's been very consistently participating with us, often in what is the middle of the night for him. So
Yes.
from
Yeah, Bebe was great.
in recording engineer school and now working. So
Tom, do you do mastering? Have you mastered things?
no, these people master things.
Yes.
Sometimes, as I suspect, some other mix engineers do. You know, we at Jack Straw, there are a lot of people who come in here who are self-producing and sometimes working on a budget. And if people have serious projects, we tell them to go get serious mastering done. And so we have sent a bunch of stuff to Resonant. And sometimes people say, no, I just need to take this away and put it on my website or submit it for approval or something. And so we do what we do to make it the best we can, but it is not of the same standard of what you've heard tonight. And hi, Peter B. Lewis. When I was a recording engineer student and first started going around to studios to find out what this industry was about, one of the first places I went was to go talk to Peter.
Great to see you.
Yeah, you know, and he tried his best, I think, to talk me out of this, but
Well, you continued on Jack Straw, which I, as a commercial studio owner, kind of hated. Now it's such a benefit to everyone.
Yeah.
I think it's terrific, and I'm glad you're doing it.
Thank you. Good.
Richard Cardoza and Rick Chin have raised hands. Do you want to say something? No.
Yeah, hi.
Oh, good. Hi, Richard.
Good evening. I'm a recent graduate from Full Sail University and audio production, and I really want to get into this field. I've been thinking of mastering because it's you know, we just did the last part of my learning journey. We did mastering, and I did excellent in mastering, and you know, I did excellent overall, thank God. But no, really, I mean, come on, at 61 years old, going back to college is not easy.
Yeah.
But I did it. I did it.
Good for you.
Yeah. And something that I love, you know, I'm from the South Bronx, grew up with all the guys who started the genre of rap music. I was a rapper, you know, all of that good stuff, sang in church, and been into music all of my life, and left it, went into the Air Force, got married, got divorced, got married. Yeah, so it's been a long ride, and then so now I'm presently in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. I don't need a tan. My wife does, but I do not. So I was just thinking of what I want to do with the rest of my journey in life, and I decided to go back to school. and, pursue my dream, of doing something significant, leaving something behind when I pass on, so that the world can enjoy something that I created, and so that's the hope. That's the hope, that I would leave something excellent for if for no one else, just for my grandkids to say, hey, grandpa did that, and perhaps give them hope,
Well, that's great. And
Fantastic.
congratulations.
I don't know
Thank
if you
you.
could hear everybody in this room is cheering you on though.
Oh man,
Everyone
thank
in
you.
here is saying, hell yeah, good for you.
Thank you so much, guys. I appreciate you all.
I
And
can
thank
relate.
you.
I got my degree finally when I was 56. So I totally get it.
Yeah.
More
Oh,
power
man.
to you. It's even harder now, but
Yeah.
All right, so those of us in the room need to leave now.
Right,
We are at the
right.
witching hour. So Janie, take over.
Yeah.
Good night, everyone.
Night.
Yeah, but Rick, what did you want to say? Goodbye, maybe? Yeah.
No, it's a matter of getting the cursor over to the unmute button.
Ah,
When
okay.
it was on the lower hand button. So, hi, Peter. Hi, good to see you. So I don't have a question. I have a comment. And the panel can elaborate on it if they wish. And if they think it's too hot a potato, they can toss it back.
Rick, we're not going to be able to elaborate on anything. We need to start wrapping up here.
Oh, okay.
So
So
I'm
my
sorry, I'll have
comment,
to save that till next time.
my comment is that I think that trying to master your own material is like self-surgery.
I completely agree.
There's
Well,
agreement in the room, and at that, we're going to leave.
Thank you. Thanks, Ed.
Thanks, everybody.
Nighty night.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.